Thank you. Now, would you please tell us your connection to Gwinnett County?
Okay, I would be delighted to. My connection to Gwinnett County runs very deep. Ironically, I've never been a Gwinnett County resident. I've never lived in Gwinnett County. I grew up in DeKalb County and still live in DeKalb County. However, I can date my family on both sides, my mother's and my father's, to the early 1830s. My father's family was from Lilburn, in a little area called Gloucester at first, which was a separate city. My mother's family was from DeKalb, and we date them or find them in the Hog Mountain area before they moved to the Rabbit Hill area of DeKalb.
And where exactly were you born, though?
I was actually born in Hugh Spalding Hospital in downtown Atlanta, which is now part of Grady. My family lived in Lilburn until a year before I was born. Now, when they lived in Gwinnett, Luxemini or Luxemini was a separate town. And they lived in the town of Luxemini and then left Luxemini and moved to Tucker.
Okay, well, tell me this. How did your family provide for you? What was your father and mother's occupation? What did they do to take care of you?
My mother was a housewife. My mother never worked. My father worked for the railroad systems, for Seaboard Coastline Railroad for 44 years. He went to the railroad to be a fireman. Went through all of the railroad fireman training, passed all of the training, took the test, and then when he went to actually get the job, they told him that there were no African Americans who could be firemen. So he had to start as a laborer and move from a laborer to a supervisor of laborers. And he did that for 44 years. His family was from Lilburn, as I said before. Behind me are actually my great-grandparents, my father's grandparents, Waddy and Clara Stevens, and we can date them in the Lilburn area as early as about 1843 or 44. They were born around 1840. Clara was born in in Alabama, and Waddy was born in South Carolina. And as children, they were sold from Alabama and South Carolina to the Lilburn area. They grew up on a plantation or a small homestead that was owned by the Stevens family. And if we look at the history of Lilburn, Stevens is a big name in Lilburn. They worked on that plantation. We find them as children going to the plantation of the Carroll family. We're in Salem Church, and the Carroll family actually was the impetus of Salem Church. When the Carroll family moved to Lilburn in 1830, we first see them in the census. In 1834 or so, they built a meeting house for their slaves. And we find my great-grandparents actually coming to that meeting house in Lilburn, and that was Waddy and Clara Stevens. They lived their life in slavery until emancipation. Waddy actually became a preacher and was an associate at Salem Church.
What about your siblings? Do you have any siblings?
I do. I am the youngest of 5 children.
Okay.
And I have two sisters who are living and 2 siblings who are deceased. My siblings, my eldest sister actually lived, well, because she was the eldest, she was in Gwinnett the longest, but she actually went to school in Gwinnett, unlike the rest of us. She went to the Salem Church school in the 1st grade, and then after the 1st grade, she went to the Hooper Renwick School, because prior to Hooper Renwick, the churches operated schools through what was called the Jean school system, which was a national school system through the South, where the government would give them limited funds. They would hire a teacher from Atlanta normally. The teacher would come and stay with relatives or stay with family members in the area where she was teaching during the school year. Go to the church building in most cases. They would turn the pews around, teach in the church. And most of those schools were from 1st to at most 9th grade. Some of them stopped at 6th grade. So my eldest sister went to Salem Church School for the 1st grade. Then in the 2nd grade, she went to Hooper Renwick School.
Okay. And how long was she at Hooper Renwick? Do you recall?
I think she was there till about the 3rd grade. Now, both my parents went to school in Gwinnett,
Okay.
in the church school system. My father went to the Salem Church school
Okay.
as long as he could go, which was a 6th grade. My mother went to what was the Appalachia Church School and to Zion Church School, because that school in DeKalb alternated between the two to the 6th grade. Because in that system, if the school stopped at 6th grade or it stopped at 9th grade, in order to continue your education, you had to know someone in Atlanta, board with a family in Atlanta, and then pay to go to the African American high schools in Atlanta, which were Turner and Washington.
Did your mother go to one of the go there?
No, they actually had to stop at 6th grade because they couldn't afford to go any
Couldn't
higher.
afford to go. Okay. Did they farm? Did your father farm at all?
My father was a gardener, and when we moved to Tucker, we had almost 2 acres. Now in Lilburn, when they were growing up, they were sharecroppers.
When they were growing up
Yes,
at
yes.
home with their parents?
They were sharecroppers.
Okay.
My father was one of 13 children
Okay.
in Lilburn. The family first lived in the Gloucester area of Lilburn. Gloucester was a separate town, but something very terrible happened to them in Gloucester, so they moved from Gloucester to Lilburn. While they were in Gloucester, my father was number 7 of 13. His eldest brother went to World War I and fought for this country in World War I. When he came back from World War I, he and his brother-in-law walked to downtown Gloucester where there was a store, had on his uniform. When he walked in the downtown area with his uniform on, he was called the N-word and said, "How dare you say you can represent our country?" He was beaten, tied behind his own car, and drug up and down the street. Then my father, who was 10 years old at the time, said that they brought him back, put him on their front porch, and surrounded the house. He said that his father grabbed his gun. My grandmother stopped him from doing that, and they just had to wait. Finally, the local doctor, who was Dr. McCurdy from Lilburn, evidently had heard what had happened, came to the house, told my grandfather that because of the time he couldn't treat him, and because of the violence that was going on, he couldn't treat him, but he would help them to get out of Gloucester. So my father says that he went with his father, got the wagon. They put my uncle on the back of the wagon. Dr. McCurdy led them out of Gwinnett, and they rode all night to Grady. My uncle stayed in Grady for about 3 weeks. As soon as he recovered, he says he went to downtown Atlanta, bought a trunk, came back to Gloucester, packed up his clothes, left Georgia, and never came back. He relocated to Chicago. After that incident, my father's family moved from the Gloucester area to the Salem Church area of Lilburn.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Now, my mother's family was from DeKalb.
Okay, now tell me a little bit about her life there, that you, as you know.
Yeah. My mother
Okay.
was one of 2 children. She only had 1 sister.
Okay.
Her mother was one of 9 children. My mother's grandfather, like my grandparents rather, like my father's grandparents, were born into slavery.
Okay.
Her grandparents were Dave and Liza Snowden.
Okay.
And there's a picture of my great-grandmother Liza
This
behind
one?
us, that one.
Okay.
Grandma Liza I never met, but my mother said she would always tell her story because her story was that she didn't work on a plantation, that she was born in a homestead of the Bell family
Okay.
in the Hog Mountain area of DeKalb. And the Bell family only owned 2 slaves, and that was Grandma Liza and her mother.
Okay.
And she says, my mother would say that she would say that when she was born, her mother told her that she was about my complexion and had curly, kinky hair. But
Now,
as
who is this? Your
That's my
great?
great-grandma
Okay.
Liza.
Okay.
But as she grew older, her skin lightened, her hair straightened, and her eyes turned from brown to gray. And she says that she would say the older she got, the worse Mrs. Bell would treat her.
Mm-hmm.
And that she and her mother would hear them arguing in the house.
Now that's the husband and the wife.
Yes.
Mr. and Mrs. Bell.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
They lived in the big house, and they would hear them arguing in the little shack that they lived out back.
Mm-hmm.
And she said that Grandma Liza, at about 11 years old, one day walked out because she heard her mother screaming, and she ran out the door. When she ran out the door and heard her mother screaming, she saw Mr. Bell crying and saying to her mother, "I love you, but to save my marriage, I have to do this." And he was tying her on the back of a wagon. She said she rushed, Grandma Liza rushed to her mother, but she was grabbed by Mrs. Bell and tied to a tree. And she had to watch her mother being carried away while she was tied to a tree. She later realized that all of that happened because her owner, Mr. Bell, was indeed her father. She continued to work for them until she was about 14. When she was about 14, they were working jointly in a field with the Snowden plantation. She saw Dave Snowden. They started to date as slaves could date, and Mr. Snowden continued to beg the Bells for Liza. He finally bought her, and she and Dave married, and my mother says that she would say at emancipation they went to Lawrenceville with all they had, which was one quilt. Worked as sharecroppers in Lawrenceville, and then moved to the Rabbit Hill community of DeKalb.
Okay.
And both my sets of great-grandparents were very instrumental in the church work. As I said, Waddy and Clara were early members of Salem.
Okay.
Grandma Liza was an early member, maybe one of the first known members of Appalachia Baptist Church, which has become Christ the King. So those are my Gwinnett roots.
Well, those are pretty strong roots there, I tell you. Did you attend school? You did not attend school at all in Gwinnett County. All your schooling was DeKalb County
All my
or somewhere.
schooling was DeKalb.
Okay.
We came back to Gwinnett every Sunday for church. We came back to Lilburn every Sunday for church. At that time, our church was very small because unlike, and I think we have to tell the whole story so we can learn and grow together. Unlike the other, well, I can't say unlike, but Lilburn was different. Almost every other town in Gwinnett has an African-American neighborhood or community that dates back to slavery. Lilburn does not.
It does.
Lilburn was one of the worst as far as race relations were concerned. History of the church, things that my parents told me, there were actually two major communities in Lilburn, African-American communities. There was a Salem Church community, and there was a Five Fork Trickham community, which was an African-American community. There were actually three churches, Salem, Little Zion, and Yellow River. Yellow River and Little Zion did not last because of race relations. Salem Church lasted, but there were really no black families in Lilburn. Well, there was one black family in Lilburn until like the 1970s.
Really?
But we all came back to Salem to church.
Oh, wow. One family in Lilburn.
One family. That was a cousin, Gladys Bailey.
Okay.
Her son was an entrepreneur in the Lawrenceville area, Frank Bailey.
That's okay.
And her youngest daughter, Priscilla Bailey Armstrong, was the first African American in Berkmar High School. As a matter of fact, when she was in Berkmar High School, she was the only black person in the school.
Was that, what year was that, you think, when she was there? Was that after 68?
It was around that time. It was when Berkmar was a totally new school.
My goodness. Well, what is your least favorite memory of Gwinnett County? Your least favorite memory of it?
I think my least favorite memory of Gwinnett County was a combination of things.
Okay.
But driving back here to church, leaving an African American community in Tucker, driving to Gwinnett, and about once a year on the Gwinnett-DeKalb border, coming down Lawrenceville Highway, right around before you get to Rockbridge Road,
Okay.
about a quarter of a mile before Rockbridge Road, the Klan would meet. And we would be riding back or riding to church, and the Klan would be passing out their flyers and waving at people and that kind of thing. Then sometimes when we got here, we would be standing in the church yard, and people would ride by and call us the N-word. You know, that coupled with all of the stories that I heard. For instance, Salem Church up until 1960 had a building that would seat about 400 people. They built a smaller building. When they tore down that building, they found 2 cases of dynamite where someone had planned to bomb the church. So it's a combination of those memories and stories.
What year was this about? Around
1960.
1960.
Mm-hmm.
That's not. That was before, way before schools were desegregated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they tore down the building in 1960.
Okay.
They don't know how long the dynamite had been in the ceiling.
That was the church building,
That was
right?
the church building.
Now, didn't you? I don't know if you did or not, but there's something called a brush harbor where they used to have they used to. Salem had church in something like
Yes,
that at
yes.
one time. Were you ever? Did it happen during your time?
No.
Growing up, happened
No,
way before.
not way before my time.
Okay.
Salem is 183 years old.
Okay.
It was established on the Carroll plantation.
Okay.
The Carroll family can be dated in Gwinnett historical records in 1830.
Okay.
In 1834, they built 5 buildings. 4 were dwellings for their slaves. 1 was a meeting house. They migrated here from the north.
The Carroll.
The Carrolls.
Okay.
John Carroll was a nephew of the Jesuit priest who was the founder of Georgetown University. When they migrated here, they bought over 900 acres. When they built those 5 buildings, the 1 meeting house, they defied the Georgia law and allowed their slaves to have worship 1 Sunday a month. Then the word got out, and people would think that it would be stopped, but it wasn't. When the word got out, other slave owners in the Lilburn area allowed their slaves to come 1 Sunday a month. That's where my grandparents, the Stevens, started to come to church. Now, that church was operated under the auspices of the plantation, so they were very limited in what they could do. The stories say that in the early morning, most people think it was at night, but they would wait until the owners were definitely asleep. About 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, they would get up, go into the woods, into what was called a brush arbor, which was an opening in the woods, and have their own worship in the style that they wanted to worship. That's where some of the Negro spirituals come from, like couldn't hear nobody pray way down yonder by myself, couldn't hear nobody pray.
Okay.
The kitchen help would sing that, letting the people in the brush arbor know that they couldn't hear them and it was okay to keep having church.
Wow. Isn't that amazing? Now, since you've told me about your least favorite thing you can remember way back, what is the one that you're most fondest of? What incident can you state to me, that you maybe like the best?
I think while I didn't like coming to Gwinnett, ironically, my favorite memories were coming back to Gwinnett because this is where my family was. My father had an uncle, and he was actually the only uncle of my father that I remembered. His name was Gregory Bailey, and he was, I guess you would call a sharecropper, or tended some property on Lawrenceville Highway right behind Providence School, and every year there would be a huge birthday celebration for him and meeting family, coming back on homecoming day at both churches, Salem and Appalachia. Appalachia the first Sunday in August,
Okay.
Salem the 3rd Sunday in August, and family, people who had migrated away, would all come back, and it would be like a big reunion. And then my father's family side, the family reunion. My father's family has had family reunions since 1924, at one of the weddings of one of his cousins.
Really?
Yes.
Wow. Did y'all, okay, now, what was your mode of transportation, though, when you were coming to church here from DeKalb, Tucker, wherever? How did y'all get here?
We came in my dad's car.
Oh, you had a car?
Yeah, we came because we're talking about the 1950s.
Oh, okay,
and
1950s. Okay.
So we came in my dad's car.
Okay.
We'd all pile in the car. He loved Chevrolets. We'd ride in Chevrolets. You know, he talks about walking to church, and his siblings walking to church, because when they came to church, you had to come to church every Sunday. You know, it was only once a month. And you could actually be put out of the church for missing 3 Sundays. And the reasons for being put out were sickness, death in your family, or high water.
Now, what does that mean? What does that mean?
High water meant that right next to Salem Church was a little creek.
Okay.
And if it rained and the creek got up to the banks, the wagons and the horses and the mules couldn't come across the creek.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Yeah, and I guess you asked about memories. It's
Yeah.
just the stories. My family were passed down lots of stories. And I think it's those stories that have sustained us and kept us close as family.
That's amazing. Simply amazing. Well, tell me this. What is your impression of Gwinnett County right now?
What is my impression of Gwinnett,
Gwinnett County right now.
I think Gwinnett County has come a long way. But I think, like the rest of the country, we have a long way to go. There was a time, in all honesty, that I said I would never live here.
Never live in
Never.
Gwinnett County?
I said I would never live in Gwinnett County because of all the stories. That mindset has changed. I think Gwinnett is growing. I think Gwinnett is striving to be a county of all people. Again, I think we have a ways to go, but I think we're working toward it. I see things now in Gwinnett that as a child I never thought I would see, even with Salem Church. When I was coming to Salem Church, there was 60 people on Sunday morning, not the 1,500 we see on Sunday morning now.
Well, you lived in DeKalb, Tucker. Now, life was better for you there in Tucker than at the time that you was living in Tucker. Was your life better there? How much better living there was your life as compared to Gwinnett? Now, what's the...
In my mind, my life was better, but in reality, it was probably all the same.
Okay. How did your parents did your parents own their home in Tucker?
Yes. They ironically, there is an original black community in Tucker.
Okay.
And the Carroll family
had something to do with that?
That started Salem Church.
Okay.
One of their grandsons actually sold property to a lot of African American families.
Okay.
Starting in like the late 1940s.
Okay.
The Peters were the first people to move there.
Okay.
And African American families bought property from the Carrolls and started a community in Tucker.
So the Carrolls was all over, huh?
Yes.
He had lots and lots of property, right?
Yes, lots of property and lots of influence.
Do you know of any of the descendants of the Carroll family right now? Do you know of any of them?
There is one granddaughter who is still living. Her name is Mary Ellen. She's not a Carroll. She's close to 90 plus years old. I think she's in a nursing home.
Oh, okay.
But she's a great granddaughter.
Okay.
A granddaughter, Miss Martin, who was considered the Lilburn historian, was instrumental in not only helping Salem Church discover its history, but helping my family discover its history through the Carroll family records.
You're a wealth of knowledge, Mr. Bailey.
Well, thank you. I don't know about that, but thank you.
You are. Well, I just want to know so much, but I don't know how to ask you, okay? I just don't know. I don't know. Tell me about your experience here at Salem. What role or what capacity do you serve in here at Salem Church, Salem Church? And when did you become a member of Salem Church?
Okay.
Please.
Salem Church is my home. and it's what's tied me to Gwinnett. I grew up in the church. There was no question. Every Sunday morning, we would come to church here. When I was growing up, we only had church 2 Sundays a month. But I always smiled because the Sundays we didn't have church, we still had to get up, get dressed, come to Sunday school, and then go back home, even though we didn't have church.
So you had Sunday school
We had
all
Sunday
Sunday.
school every Sunday. But we only had church twice a month.
Wow.
My dad was very active here. He was a church clerk. My mother was very active. Once she left Appalachia, she was over the mother's ministry. All of my brothers and sisters grew up here, my aunts, my uncles. For a number of years after college, I served as Director of Christian Education. Currently, I am on staff at the church. The title of the position is Director of Community and Social Service Ministry. So anything we do outside the walls of the church, anything we do to help the entire community, I oversee that.
Do you like it?
Oh, I love being here. I've been here 4 years. Prior to that, my education is in social work and education.
Okay.
I was a social worker for several years, and I did adult education for several years prior to coming here.
Okay. Well, I think Salem must be very fortunate to have you
Well,
on staff and as a member.
thank you so
I
much.
think so. I really do. I really do. I don't know anything else to ask you, but I know there's a lot of more stuff there that I need to pull out, okay? I know there is.
Well, I've enjoyed it, and we're here at Salem every day. One thing that people may not know about our church is we have our Heritage Hall, which dates our history. We have written record that dates back to 1862, and we're open for people to come and hear our story anytime.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Bailey.
Thank you.